What is bullying? Bullying is unwanted, aggressive behavior among school-age children that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. The behavior is repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time. Bullying is an act of violence that can have a long-lasting emotional or physical impact on the target as well as the bully themselves. More research has been going into the idea of the target bully, those that are both the targets of bullying as well as perpetrators who may be at greatest risk for poor psychosocial outcomes. So across the board, harm can include psychological distress, behavioral problems, and physical consequences, even including death. So in order to be considered bullying, the behavior must be aggressive and include, firstly, an imbalance of power. So kids who bully use their power, such as physical strength or even perceived higher social status or fluency in language and culture, to control or harm others. I have seen this in my work as well as in the conversations I've had with refugee youth and other advocates. They noted that any perceived difference between refugee youth and other students could be preyed upon. When I asked about what some of these differences were, the answer was always the same: everything. So, for example, students that spoke with an accent, students that were smaller, as of course size and bone structure varies across culture. A few people noted that it was even in the way that refugee youth could carry themselves. They didn't always know that to be perceived as strong, you have to walk tall, pull your shoulders up, make direct eye contact, speak boisterously, in some ways adopt a seemingly aggressive stance and conform to traditional gender and societal roles. For example, one advocate noted to me with a sigh, refugee boys may not know that they can't wear pink. Next, for repetition, bullying behaviors, they happen more than once or have the potential to happen more than once. So students are basically living in fear of when the next incident will be. Not if, but when. Bullying includes actions such as making threats, spreading rumors, attacking someone physically or verbally, and excluding someone from a group on purpose. Bullying is more than just physical assaults. It's about creating an environment of intimidation, humiliation, hostility, and fear. Refugees experience direct aggression, such as racial slurs, derogatory comments about customs, food, religion, as well as physical assaults. Comments range from being called a terrorist for some of the Arab refugee youth or monkeys for some of the African refugee youth. One student shared with me just how bad the physical assaults could be as well. He recounted an experience on the bus coming home from school when non-refugee students started systematically, physically punching and kicking refugee students at once and stealing and smashing phones. When the bus driver noticed, he slowed the bus down and refugee youth literally leapt off the bus and were stranded on the side of the road. Indirect examples of bullying include phenomena such as exclusion from social events or conversation, in essence, exclusion from student life. So identity-based bullying is discrimination directed towards an individual because of characteristics related to a youth's identity, such as their race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or physical appearance. When refugee youth are targets of bullying because of their refugee status, country of origin, race, religion, and so on, this too is identity-based bullying. What is often the case is that identity-based bullying contributes to an environment where bias becomes ubiquitous, subtle, and accepted. Overtly accepted if teachers and staff are contributing to the bullying, or passively accepted if they don't do anything to stop it. The Department of Justice stated in a report that when a person is targeted because of his or her identity, community members who share the victim's identity may also feel unsafe and threatened. This can exacerbate already existing tensions within the community, especially if community members already feel marginalized because of their identity. This means that if you are a member of that community, you feel targeted when others have been bullied, but you haven't, because you live in fear that, again, it's not a matter of if, but when you will get bullied, when it becomes your turn. Research has shown that identity-based bullying is associated with more compromised health than other forms of bullying. It's also important to note that bullying in a refugee context can also occur from one refugee group to another or from one minority group to another. Sometimes we tell ourselves, we live in a diverse area, our school is very diverse here. Students here know what it's like to experience discrimination based on their identity. They're not going to be the ones who are perpetrating it. And yes, while it may be the case that we have a very diverse school system, that does not mean that bullying is not happening from one minority group to another. Anti-refugee sentiment is on the rise. Nativist attitudes slam refugees for symbolizing a crumbling of how they define America and American values. It's also tied to security concerns and terrorism threats. This is nothing new. Immigrants have long been feared and persecuted. What makes it unique today is not just the ties to the, quote, war on terror, but also the 24-hour news cycle and social media, which can give these sentiments a platform into people's homes all day, every day. As global stories of terrorism mounts, refugees have borne a significant brunt of the backlash. For example, after the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, over 30 state governors publicly called to ban Syrian refugees from being resettled in their states. A basic search of news stories sheds light onto the fear-mongering that refugees have been swept up in. For example, one headline read, quote, "Accepting Muslim refugees, American charity over national safety," implying that the U.S. refugee program is a security threat. Another, quote, "Alert, here are the 190 U.S. cities Obama has picked to send Muslim, quote, refugees." The very notion of their refugee status is being called into question. With refugees from Central America, people pejoratively state that they're not really refugees, but they're, quote, gangbangers or they're thugs, and they want to infiltrate U.S. cities. Similarly, Syrian refugees are portrayed not actually as refugees, but as a terrorist Trojan horse. This highlighting of, quote, Muslim refugees is also significant because lawmakers have proposed that, yes, we should admit Syrian refugees, but permitting that they're Christian. Other news stories point to crimes supposedly committed by refugees to conjure more fear of refugees, such as a Drudge article titled, quote, "Syrian refugees rape little girl at knife point in Idaho," which was later confirmed to be false. The overall sentiment, though, is that refugees are a threat to our lives and our way of life. One of the deepest forms of discrimination in the United States is arguably against African Americans, and African refugees are not spared even when their, quote, Americanness is called into question. African refugees can be called, quote, monkeys and told to, quote, go back to the jungle, or asked if they live in the jungle even here in the United States. Asian refugees receive a brunt of discrimination tied to gender roles. Boys with a smaller build or shy demeanor are taunted for being, quote, too feminine, whereas Asian girls can be sexually fetishized. One advocate told me about a story that made her sick to even recount, of how some boys would go up to a Burmese or Bhutanese refugee girl in the hallway school and in a mock, quote, Asian accent, offer money for sex. And again, keep in mind that differences in identity and power, real and perceived, exist across these refugee groups as well. This can be prompted by long-standing beliefs and prejudices, as well as resentment about preferential treatment or services towards certain refugee or immigrants that starts here in the United States. So how does identity-based bullying affect Muslim students? We conducted a survey with over 100 Muslim youth in Montgomery County, Maryland, and found that 1 in 5 students felt intimidated, harassed, humiliated, bullied, or emotionally and physically abused by classmates because they are Muslim. This number jumps to 1 in 4 students when considering only the male respondents. Students reported incidents ranging from being called terrorists and told to go back to where you came from stories of someone walking past them in the hallway and shouting boom to mimic a bomb going off. 10% of students felt like a teacher or school administrator treated them unfairly because they're Muslim. There are so many examples of this as well from our work. One student reported how her teacher pointed her out in class and, quote, jokingly, said that the student may have a bomb under her headscarf. In other cases, it's what teachers don't do or don't say that's important. For example, in one case, a Muslim student stated, "ISIS is not a representative of all Muslims." Another student muttered, "Yes, they are." The teacher ignored the comments and moved on. The Muslim student reported feeling that she had a target on her back because she was ostensibly lumped in with the ideologies and atrocities committed by ISIS. One teacher handed out a magazine after the attacks in San Bernardino with the cover story, quote, "When jihadists pose as suburban parents." That student feared that others would think she was secretly an ISIS operative and that they would take action accordingly. Next, 8% of students felt that their classmates or teachers have treated them unfairly or differently because they wear traditional Islamic symbols. And in most cases, this was the headscarf worn by some Muslim girls. They told us of experiences of getting their scarf literally torn off their heads, or walking home from school and having to run home once motorists started screaming racial slurs at them from their cars. 15% of students felt isolated or excluded from social situations because they're Muslim. This isolation or alienation can lead to a cultural homelessness or marginalization, where youth do not feel connected to any community. This can make them vulnerable to a whole host of issues. So Hindu students, they can also experience identity-based bullying. A number of refugees who are Hindu, such as those from Bhutan, can also experience religious discrimination. A study from the Hindu American Foundation, published this year in 2016, surveyed a number of Hindu American students here in the United States. They found that 1 out of 3 respondents said they had been bullied for their religious beliefs. Half of the total sample indicated feelings of awkwardness or social isolation because of their religious identity. More than 3 out of 5 respondents said that their school focused on caste and Hinduism, including inaccurate claims about the religion and Indian social practice. About 1 in 8 respondents said that their teacher made sarcastic remarks about Hinduism in front of a class. About 1 out of every 4 respondents surveyed said she or he was put on the spot or singled out by a teacher when the section on Hinduism was discussed. About 1 in 4 respondents said they had been bullied within the past year, with about a third saying that those who bullied them were making fun of Hindu traditions. Hindu students were made fun of for being, quote, backwards or belonging to a, quote, crazy religion that perpetrated all these injustices. Students also noted being singled out by other students or even teachers, and in some instances even being proselytized to so that they could, quote, be saved. Of course, Hindus, Muslims, these are just 2 examples here of religious-based bullying. But of course, it's not limited to just these groups. There are, of course, Christians who adhere to different faith traditions that are being bullied. Sikh youth who are being bullied. Again, this is affecting different religious groups in different ways, and I really encourage people to read more about some of these other examples too. So a lot of the stories that I've shared, particularly from teachers, points to how not all bullying is overt. In fact, there are examples where teachers didn't even realize that some of their comments were a form of harassment. That's where implicit bias comes in. So adults and youth across the board harbor implicit biases that by definition we're not always aware of. Implicit bias are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These are subconscious, so we can't always name them or notice when we're acting from them. And as a result, we may not always conceal them out of social and or political correctness because, again, we don't know that we're doing it. People don't want to admit that we have these biases. We want to believe that we live in a, quote, post-racial world or that we, move in more open-minded circles. The reality, though, is that clients we work with are impacted by racism, and sometimes on a daily basis. If we do not acknowledge that racism, if we don't name it, and particularly in the more painful ways that we may be contributing to it, we are denying their pain and experiences, which creates deeper scars individually and societally. A lot of clients come to our agency because of discrimination that they have experienced by other service providers or educators. And they probably are very well-intentioned and didn't intend to harm their clients or students. And so these are individuals who, in their behavior imply things to the client that, maybe the client would be better off if they abandoned certain cultural or religious practices. Or, when it comes to some of our clients who may be brown or black, if providers exhibit fear of these clients. And I've heard this myself. One time an educator said to me, this kid, Mohammed, you don't get, he's scary. He scares us. And I had to ask her how a 15-year-old boy was so scary. I said, what makes him so scary? Because everybody was responding to him like he was, in their words, a scary, scary man. What made him so scary? Implicit biases develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages, especially through the media. Everybody holds implicit biases, refugee and non-refugee. Our role, though, as providers and educators is to recognize our biases, because we are in a position of relative power. And so our biases have the potential to harm refugees in greater and in even institutionalized ways. It's our job to critically examine what our biases may be and commit ourselves to walk on a path where we are open to changing them. So one example where I sometimes see a lot of implicit bias is in the way that we talk about acculturation. So for starters, what is acculturation? Acculturation is a dynamic process of change that individuals undergo as they interact with and adapt to a new or different cultural environment. It is a multidimensional, interactive process that has cognitive, affective, and behavioral components. So, things that impact their psychological identity, as well as their behaviors such as language, customs, traditions. Acculturation is contextually based. It looks different whether you're in the public domain, the private domain, whether you're with family, at school, in the community, at the workplace. Any one of these singular representations doesn't define us, and at the same time, we're also more than just the sum of these parts. All of these different aspects, they're consistently interacting with each other, as well as all aspects of a client's identity. So their race, their gender, their sexual orientation. Another thing about acculturation is that it's a two-way process. So just as, in this case, refugee clients may be changing, the culture around them is also changing. Here within the United States, the culture of what it means to be American is also changing. It's shifting, it's expanding, it's growing. Again, this is a two-way process. So, implicit bias and how we talk about acculturation. So I just went through the definition of acculturation, and unfortunately, this isn't always the definition that a lot of people are referring to, the one that they're using. Sometimes in practice, we're using much more outdated, one-dimensional definitions. So definitions that imply that that it's a linear spectrum where individuals start at one point on the spectrum, and then with all of their with their quote ethnic identity, and then as they progress on this spectrum, they shed their ethnic identity, and of course how we understand it, usually in its outward manifestations. But they shed that ethnic identity and adopt quote an American identity, again one that we have defined. And so as you can see, this is a really racist definition because it creates this value system of who's the good immigrant, who's the bad immigrant. The immigrants that we're comfortable with are the ones that we deem to be, quote, more American. Why I say that this sometimes is an implicit bias is because when we're talking to kids and to youth, a lot of times when we're throwing around these phrases like assimilation or Americanization, we really have to think of the value that we're putting behind it. So as a quick example, as I was explaining to some providers and educators about the services that we offer, how we serve refugees who are from certain regions. One educator said to me, we're working with somebody, he falls into that geographic category, but I don't know if he'd be a good fit for your program. And we said, why? And they said, well, because he's pretty Americanized. And so for us, that made us kind of step back, because what we realized is that a lot of providers and a lot of educators, they're operating from this one-dimensional definition where they suddenly erase a client's ethnic identity and their ethnic background, and they act like it has no bearing on who they are as a person, no bearing on their presenting problems or issues or concerns, and no bearing on their strengths and how it is that they're going to work through some of these challenges. Instead, what we're doing is, we're basically saying that for our clients, their differences, their deficiencies. That's the message that we're sending to our youth when we describe the good immigrant, the Americanized immigrant, and then we speak about a client's ethnic identity as some baggage that needs to be checked at the door in order for them to be accepted in our classrooms and into our society. So as a tip for teachers, it's really important that you're mindful of the language that you're using. If you're inferring that you're not comfortable with somebody, with someone's ethnic or racial or religious or what have you identity, we're contributing to a splitting or a dissociation within youth. They feel that they don't fit in anywhere and that they are very uncomfortable with their identity and being whole selves. So now to move on to another form of bullying. So cyberbullying is harassment through the use of technology and an electronic medium. Cyberbullying includes repeatedly sending offensive, rude, humiliating, and insulting messages, spreading rumors, gossip, or misleading information about someone in a public forum, posting and sending pictures without that person's consent, including digitally altered images, impersonating someone, stealing their identity, tricking someone into revealing embarrassing information and then forwarding that information to others. Cyberbullying can have similar psychological, emotional, and social effects as other forms of bullying. It's important to note, though, how cyberbullying can be unique. It can occur 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which means that targets have fewer opportunities to protect themselves from being vulnerable to an assault. Cyberbullying can also have longer-lasting effects on the target. For example, an offensive text message can be reread multiple times, each time reopening wounds and disrupting an individual's process of coping, healing, moving forward. Cyber platforms also enable perpetrators to disseminate offensive content to a large number of people, which means that rumors can go viral more quickly. Once a message goes viral, the target may have limited control over deleting any offensive content. Cyberbullying can confer greater anonymity to the perpetrator. The anonymous nature of the internet means that the bully may not always be identifiable, which makes it difficult for the victim to hold someone accountable or to seek recourse.